Black and Latino communities still are being vaccinated at a fraction of the share of white people in this country. What equity actually would look like is if we were overrepresented.
In New York City, we know which zip codes were ill, where Black and brown populations live. We know household crowding data, and those are not the areas getting vaccinated to the data today. And that problem is replicating itself in every country in the world.
Wouldn't we be better off if every country could be making these vaccines?
What techniques and technologies and learned practices can we apply to the next pandemic?
And the resources are entirely human. You have to train the people to have the capability to do this. This is not trivial. It's not accidental that Moderna's in Cambridge, folks.
Good evening and welcome. Class Act is honored to present health disparities and the COVID-19 vaccine. I am Marian Dry, co-chair with Jonathan Sprague of Class Act HR 73. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce my two classmates, Dr. Deborah Wynn and Dr. Johnson Lightfoot, who will be our moderators this evening. Dr. Lightfoot is a radiologist and medical director of the Department of Radiology at Pomona Valley Hospital Medical Center in Southern California. He chairs the Commission for Women and Diversity on the American College of Radiology Board of Chancellors. Dr. Deborah Wynn has held leadership positions at the National Cancer Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, and at the National Center for Health Statistics, part of the CDC. Johnson and Debbie, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Marian. My co-moderator, Johnson Lightfoot, and I will be starting off by introducing our panelists and then directing questions to each of them. This will be followed by our alternating and engaging our panelists on 4 important discussion topics related to health disparities and COVID-19 vaccines. Finally, Johnson and I will pose questions we received from you, the audience, to our panelists before turning the program back to Marian for our calls to action. I will introduce Dr. Kenneth Chien first. He's Harvard class of 1973. Ken is a distinguished professor of the Swedish Research Council at the Karolinska Institute near Stockholm, Sweden, and he's a co-founder of Moderna Incorporated. As a physician scientist, he has worked on the core technologies of the Moderna COVID vaccine. Johnson.
Thank you, Debbie. Dr. Uche Blackstock is Harvard College class of 1999 and Harvard Medical School class of 2005. She's an emergency medicine physician, and she is the founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity, which partners with healthcare and related organizations to address racism in healthcare and to eradicate racial health inequities. In 2019, she was recognized by Forbes magazine as one of the 10 diversity and inclusion trailblazers you need to get familiar with. Ms. Nina Schwalbe is Harvard College class of 1988, and she is the principal at Spark Street Advisors, a global health think tank and strategic advisory service, which she founded in 2016. She previously served as managing director at Gavi, the vaccine alliance that's leading the global COVAX facility. Nina was acting chief of health at UNICEF, which is the largest distributor of vaccines worldwide. Nina also serves on the faculty of Columbia University as adjunct assistant professor. Debbie?
Johnson and I have questions for each of you. I'll start off with a question for Dr. Chien. Ken, you helped co-found Moderna Incorporated and were involved in developing core technologies for its vaccines. My 2 questions for you are, 1, did concerns about population diversity influence how the Moderna vaccine was developed and tested? And the second is, now that the mRNA vaccines have been found to be effective, what are your thoughts on what vaccine science can do to build in more equity in developing new vaccines and distributing them?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Nina and the others, Marian, for the invitation. This is quite, I think, a very noble effort here, and very timely as well. So let me take your questions in order. First is about population diversity. And first of all, this is probably one of the most timely and important issues right now. Of course, we're trying to actually get the vaccine to as many people, not only in the United States, but also in the world. And there are a number of reasons why diversity is important. So I want to just take a minute to emphasize those. And they really divide up into the variable responses that the vaccine has in terms of safety and efficacy in distinct subsets of patients. These break down to medical issues, age issues, pre-existing conditions, of course, gender as well, particularly in some of the side effects. Autoimmune patients that have autoimmune problems, cancer chemotherapy, transplant patients. And it turns out a lot of these patients were actually excluded in the trials, and we're discovering that these patients actually may not mount a fully protective response to the vaccine. I think everyone's aware of the age issues and how some younger individuals, particularly children, for some reason, are not as susceptible. And then, of course, the pre-existing conditions. So I think this is a big issue. Now, what are the sort of issues right now in terms of diversity? And this is, first of all, I want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of Moderna. I'm speaking on behalf of my own personal views. And actually, right now, I have no formal relationship with Moderna, aside as a cheerleader, I'd say, at this stage. And so in the United States, the way I see it right now, and this is my own perspective, I think there are a number of barriers that we have related to vaccine hesitancy. These break down into individual regions. I think others are much more familiar with this and are expert in this than I am. And I also want to say I wish that we, and I use the royal we now, speaking for the entire field of mRNA vaccines for a minute, had given more concern to these and the outset. We should have seen these, I think, quite frankly. These break down into rural issues, inner city issues, ethnic issues, language issues, cultural issues. And I think you're all very familiar with that in the United States. It's on the TV every night now. Globally, there are other issues, of course, and these relate to a number of problems with the vaccines, the mRNA vaccines that I'm speaking for right at this point. The need for refrigeration, in certain cases, ultra cold freezers, stability, also the need for multiple doses, also the need for the cost related to it. They're much more costly, and also scalability. And then finally, I think, and related to, I would like to say one thing, that Moderna did actually slow down its recruitment because it wasn't diverse enough, and that slowed down our reporting of the phase 3 results. And that had quite a big impact because Moderna was substantially ahead of Pfizer and BioNTech in terms of timelines. In other words, we had started initiating the vaccine way before they had. And that was a very difficult decision, but the appropriate decision was made. And diversity is clearly reflected in the phase 3 results. So I think that is, I'd like to say that clearly. In terms of how to get this and to build more equity and diversity, one of the hot topics, of course, now are patents. And the idea is, and I think it's a noble idea, is how do we get more of these mRNA vaccines that appear to be best in class at this point to more people? And I think that's, again, a noble, meritorious goal. The barriers that I see, though, are substantial, and I'd say this from a technical standpoint. First of all, refrigeration, freezing. Not every place will be able to have access to these from that standpoint. Stability. You need 2 doses. You're going to have to bring people back for a second dose. Cost. The cost of nucleotide for a unmodified nucleotide, to make unmodified mRNA, is versus the modified. The modified is 50-fold more expensive, just to give you an idea of the cost differential. And of course, scalability. Now, what's interesting with the patent discussion, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Moderna has already taken the position that they will not enforce their patents. So actually, anyone can go out and make the Moderna vaccine. We know what the components are, and it's wide open from that standpoint. But I see, one of the difficulties here, and I'll make an analogy that may be kind of crude, but we're all starting to go to restaurants again, and we go to our favorite restaurants, and we've all tried to make whatever our favorite restaurant was making, probably at home recently. But you realize it's hard to do. One is you can't get the right ingredients. Two, you may not have the instrumentation that they have. There's, some of these restaurants are quite fancy. You can't get the foam right. You can't get whatever. I mean, there's all sort of kind of a molecular component to gastronomy right now. And you can't get the ingredients. And even if you had all that, you still don't have the know-how how to put it all together. And it's one thing if it's a meal and, okay, it didn't turn out right. It's another thing if it's a medicine that's going to go into people. And it's going to people who are trusting that this is the same thing that we're getting in the United States. So I feel fairly strongly that safety is going to have to be at a minimum, let alone efficacy, proven. With these. And by the time you get done that, it's not going to help us. And I think the key is we got to figure out how do we get this done now? Okay, time is wasting. Now, I do think there's a role here for other countries to collaborate and form consortiums, and we can discuss that at a later time. But I think those are the points that I think are important. One other thing is that the other vaccines that are non-mRNA, I actually believe are going to save the world, not the mRNA vaccines. And the reasons are very clear. It's pennies to the dollar in cost, no refrigeration, single administration. And one of these is looking quite good, Sanofi and GSK, which is not an mRNA vaccine. It's a protein-based vaccine. And then the DNA vaccines like AstraZeneca are actually looking good. They look like they affect the variant. The problem right now is the major site that AstraZeneca designated to generate the vaccines for the entire world, pennies on the dollar, including India, is in India. And they're so affected by COVID, they can't even manufacture the vaccine. But that is starting to break. So what should happen is we should get those people vaccinated as soon as possible with the mRNA vaccine so that then they can make the other vaccines and then get them out to the world. That's my view. And so I'm going to stop there, and I think hopefully I've put enough controversial issues on the table here to get us started.
Indeed, I think you have, Ken. Dr. Blackstock, Uche, you have been involved in advancing health equity. In fact, that's the name of the organization that you founded. How has our national and state distribution plan and execution for the COVID vaccine been manifested in your patient populations in New York?
Mm-hmm. Right. Anyway, first, I'd like to say thank you so much for having me as a guest on this panel this evening. I could not say no to Dr. Lightfoot, who attended medical school with my mother. So any of my mother's classmates asked me to be on a panel, I have to say yes. So thank you for having me. So I am an emergency physician, and I was working last spring here in New York City when it was the epicenter. And I actually saw with my own eyes my patient population shift within weeks to mostly Black and brown patients. They were mostly essential workers and service workers. And I even said to the staff at the urgent care site I was working at, I said, do you notice that all our patients look like us now? And I have to say, just going back a little bit, that once I had seen that the patients in China who did poorly were patients with chronic diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, I knew that Black communities and other communities of color were going to be heavily impacted. And so I actually just started writing. I actually wrote several op-eds. One was in Scientific American, another in Slate, about how I was very concerned that due to systemic racism, right, that was exposed by the pandemic, that these communities would be most disproportionately impacted. And we've seen that so far in terms of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And I was hoping that we would learn from that, right? That we would learn from that, the beginning of the pandemic. But I feel like the vaccine rollout process, while I think equity has been considered, I think that it feels a lot like it's an afterthought. And I want to say that, a lot of the issues, the structural issues that we're dealing with are, decades and centuries old. So to be able to address them within a short period of time, obviously, is a very challenging task. But I think that there were some things in the rollout process that we could have done differently. One, I think that, allocating vaccines according to need versus population is sort of like taking the colorblind approach, essentially. Vaccines, I feel, should have been allocated by which areas were hardest hit. And that's a matter of using different metrics like the CDC's Structural Vulnerability Index. There are other indices that have been developed. There's a COVID-19 community index that could have been used. So that was one concern that I had, but also this idea of having these priority groups. And of course, I think group one, I think most people probably would not have had an issue with, because those were healthcare workers who were the most exposed and people in long-term care facilities who were the most vulnerable. But again, I think that those were also colorblind approaches, because both those groups were actually disproportionately white as well. Because when you look at who most healthcare workers are, it is mostly white. And when you look at who has the longest life expectancy in this country, it's not people of color. So I think the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices tried to use chronic diseases as a surrogate and other, essential worker positions. But I think that when we think about how brutally systemic racism impacts health, and then not to really consider it explicitly in the rollout process, we see what we've seen so far, and that's that we have under-vaccinated Black and Latino populations significantly, and we still have. My concern was when eligibility opened in April that we would maybe see some reinforcement of these inequities, because some of the kinks in registration processes, accessibility weren't worked out. But it looks like in the last 2 weeks, over half the people who have received vaccines are people of color. But I think that what happens is once you throw fixed age cutoffs out the window, open eligibility to as many people as possible, you increase accessibility. Those people who had difficulty getting vaccines are able to access the vaccines. There still are about 30 million people out there who are considered vaccine amenable. These are people who are mostly working class. They don't have college education. Many of them are concerned about missing work because they don't have paid time off to get their vaccines. They are basically just trying to survive. And so we need to think about ways that we can help these 30 million people to get these vaccines. I think employers can do a lot in terms of, the Biden administration has offered a tax credit to businesses for offering their employees paid sick leave, but you can have on-site vaccine clinics and offer other incentives. Really, at this point, if we hope to reach that herd immunity threshold, then we really need to think about sort of innovative ways that we can get vaccines to everybody. And I think that, really the message is bringing the vaccines to the people. So again, there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. I think if we are thinking about getting to that 70% of Americans with one dose by July 4th, that we need to think about more local and hyper-local efforts in terms of vaccine distribution and using, community-based organizations, so organizations that are already embedded in these communities to help, with access and outreach as well as education.
Thank you, Dr. Blackstock. We'll come back. Very interesting phrases evolving about vaccines. We have vaccine hesitancy. Now we have vaccine amenable, vaccine convenient, and we'll talk about that a little later in the hour. Nina, Ms. Schwalbe, vaccination rates are really variable, highly variable geographically across the world and in different social and cultural contexts. Can you talk about some of your recent work in New York and how they may relate to global rates of vaccination patterns, distribution, and what we can do to help improve them?
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for this very impressive class of 73. I'm the class secretary for my class, and I must say that the acumen with which you've organized this is a lesson to us all. So it will certainly brought back to our class, and greetings to any 88ers on the call. So I work in a field which we call precision public health, and the idea is to use data from traditional and emerging sources to target interventions for populations by person, place, and time, with a focus exactly on reducing health disparities. Precision public health involves working with and for communities with a heavy focus on community engagement. And as the two previous colleagues have both said, from the first studies from Wuhan in early 2020, the data were crystal clear. We were never all at equal risk of severe outcomes from COVID-19. Those most at risk were the elderly and people with underlying health conditions, including diabetes, heart disease, obesity, hypertension. So underlying health conditions are highly correlated with what we call social determinants of health. The most important, at least from a statistical perspective of social determinants, are socioeconomic status and education. And these are often intersectional with other determinants. Race and ethnicity are also critical as they affect both access to and quality of care received. So as with other health issues, the very underlying conditions that make people vulnerable to severe COVID are driven by social determinants. And those with unmanaged chronic conditions, in other words, they didn't have or don't have access to care, are most vulnerable and were most vulnerable to severe COVID outcomes. And the result is what, if you read Richard Horton's Lancet article, what they call a syndemic, co-pandemic underpinned by poverty and structural inequity. The unfortunate part is that social determinants have been completely underemphasized in our response. As Uche mentioned, in the US, Black and Brown Americans have the highest COVID death rates, and they also have the highest rates of obesity and diabetes. So in terms of the response, in addition to being prioritized for access to primary health care, they also should have been first in line for the vaccines. However, and I was, Black and Hispanic New Yorkers make up about 30% of the population of our city and had the highest death rates. By the end of March, when vaccines were available, they made up only 18% of those vaccinated. And the statistics were pretty similarly grim for Black New Yorkers. So the criminal part of this, from my perspective, is that we didn't use the data that were available to target those most vulnerable, which led to avoidable deaths. In public health, the four components of access, when we talk about access to medicines, we talk about affordability, acceptability, availability, and accessibility. The media focused on acceptability and fixated on hesitancy. However, and I think again, Uche has mentioned this, accessibility was much more, if not the primary issue, certainly in the early days of the rollout. We have ample data here: morbidity, mortality by zip code, Medicaid, Medicare rosters, voter registration data. We know how many people live in each household, the age, the sex. We can sell them anything from the data we have available, and also data on race and ethnicity. But the vaccination strategy that was applied was really a one-size-fits-all. The state focused on mass vaccination sites and asked the community to get to the vaccines instead of asking the vaccines to get to the community or bringing the vaccines to the community. From my work in District 1 in New York City, which covers a significant proportion of Lower Manhattan, we know the vulnerable could not get access to the early vaccine appointments. The mass sites were far from the community. I mean, I don't know how many people in this call who live in New York have actually even been to the Javits Center. They were hard to get to. There were language issues, lack of translation, internet-related barriers, and demand far exceeded supply. And as also Uche mentioned, before people in category 1A or B had the chance to find appointments, the eligibility expanded, putting them further down the list. And many of the deaths that occurred after the vaccines were theoretically available were thus really avoidable, including in our community. So if we take that experience, I'll just shift now to the global situation and COVAX, which I'm sure many of you have read about the news. Last spring, the COVAX initiative was launched. COVAX is a global collaboration designed to facilitate the development of and access to COVID vaccines for all countries. Through the COVAX facility, low-income countries can request doses at no cost through a scheme subsidized by donors. And middle and high-income countries can also purchase doses through this mechanism. Unfortunately, the mechanism has hit a number of roadblocks. First, there have been issues around affordability, and Ken spoke to some of that, with a lack of adequate financing to reserve the required doses. So a lot of countries sort of reserved doses up front before they were available, but you had to pay up front for that reservation, an options market essentially. Second, there have been problems around availability and supply constraints. So of the 1.8 billion doses required to vaccinate 20 to 30% of the populations of the poorest countries, so 1.8 billion doses required, only about 53 million doses have been delivered to date. And this, as Ken mentioned, has been further constrained by India. What probably most people don't know is the majority of vaccines for low-income countries are actually produced in India. So when India restricted export, that obviously affected COVAX. They were the biggest supplier to the COVAX facility. Third, there are reports that acceptability has been an issue, and some countries, because of hesitancy or lack of confidence, have not been able to distribute the doses they have received. But finally, and this is the critical point, is as we saw in New York, is the issue of accessibility. And while in some countries, weak health systems constrain delivery and few doses of those received have been distributed. So we do have countries that have received, DRC has received over 1 million doses and distributed less than 1% of those. For others that have exhausted their supply, so a bunch of countries got the supply and have finished them, there's actually no data on who the doses went to, and whether they went to frontline health workers or those most at risk. And anecdotally, what we hear is that also in the poorest countries, the wealthiest have been first in line. So on the global scale, while the media focuses on affordability, availability, rightly intellectual property, dose sharing, the US hoarding doses, both of which are incredibly important, we also really need to double down on accessibility. Because as what we are seeing on the ground in low-income countries and middle-income countries is exactly what we saw here in District 1 and New York. Even where doses are available, those at the highest risk of severe COVID, particularly those who are structurally marginalized, are just not first in line in terms of access.
Thank you, Nina. Debbie, would you like to pose questions to our entire panel here?
Yes, thank you. At this time, Dr. Lightfoot and I have some questions that we'd like all of you to weigh in on. The first of these discussion topics is, how important have collaborations and partnerships with institutions and individuals been in helping you address issues of equity in vaccine development, availability, accessibility, and distribution?
We've been working together with the New York City Department of Health to actually work on training for healthcare providers in order to help them with motivational interviewing skills so they can speak with their patients about vaccines. One thing that we found was really important and that we didn't see is that, vaccines were not given to primary care physicians or family physicians or nurse practitioners, and these are people that studies have shown are very well trusted and patients will listen to. And so in this phase of the rollout, we thought it was incredibly important because patients will be going to see their physicians and many will not have been vaccinated yet, for them to actually, for these providers to actually have the skills to engage in a conversation that will be productive and to help encourage patients to take a vaccine. Obviously, we're not forcing anyone, but also giving them the motivational interviewing skills to do so. So that's one thing that we've been working with the New York City Department of Health on. Another thing I've been doing is working with community groups, community-based organizations around town halls, just giving out information and answering questions on the vaccines. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there, as we all know. And I think that for many people in my community or who look like me, there's something very different about me coming to speak to them, answering their questions about the vaccine that kind of destigmatizes vaccines. So I've been working with several community-based organizations to make sure that people have the information about vaccines that they need to make an informed choice. Oh, and thank you, Tammy. Tammy in the chat reviewed the materials that my sister and I had developed the New York City Department of Health. Yeah, so definitely if anyone's interested, you can go to the website and it's available for everyone for free.
And I think the COVAX collaboration is incredibly impressive. The COVAX is a global collaboration and it focuses on drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. There are 3 pillars. And for the vaccine pillar, I really tried to bring together industry, donors, countries, communities, civil society to figure out what was needed. There's a process in global health whereby the WHO, with lots of input, set something called a target product profile. And it says, okay, we're not going to buy a vaccine unless it's 50% effective, unless it fits these cold chain standards. Ideally, it would be one shot. So they give the developers at least some rough guidance on what would be acceptable, so that when a manufacturer puts something out there, it's not, completely up in the air. And really thinking through the stakeholders that need to be engaged. It's been impressive and at least a good attempt to try to have equitable distribution, and that will continue. They're starting a new pillar on manufacturing, and there are similar pillars around oxygen distribution. So it's across all the issues, and people are trying to work together.
Thank you very much. Dr. Chin.
I just wanted to say, actually, 2 days ago, and this was not prompted by this forum, Moderna announced that they had an agreement with Gavi and also with COVAX to provide up to, I think it was something like 60 million doses of the mRNA vaccine at the lowest possible cost. I don't know if it's at cost, but it's probably near cost. So that's happened, which I fully endorse. And quite frankly, I wish we'd done that sooner. But the issue, of course, is we were trying to, get the United States situation under control. And because that's where Moderna received a lot of support from the United States. And I think, we can argue with that. But I mean, I think that is, a reasonable decision from that standpoint. That being said, I do think there's a need for another level, and I want to talk about a consortium idea, because I think the consortium now, we have two issues. One is, what do we do right now? And what we got to do right now is get vaccines that work. I don't care if they're mRNA, whatever, that's already approved, that are safe, made by people that have documented safety and efficacy, to as many healthcare workers in the world, primary people on the front line, and any place that is making vaccines, like in India, and they got to get vaccinated immediately. And that has to happen right away. In other words, just to give you an example, Moderna made the decision that people are working 24/7 to crank out as many vaccines as possible. Same thing with BioNTech and Pfizer. So early on, what Moderna decided to do was to vaccinate everybody that was on the front line making the vaccine, which was a good decision because, we were in the middle of a surge. I was not one of them, and I actually had to drive to Foxborough to get my vaccine. I waited in line because I didn't fulfill the criteria. But I think that's an important point. The second thing is, what do we do about the next pandemic? That's what we should be thinking about also. And here, it's probably going to be not in the United States where it starts. It's going to be in a remote area, most likely, where they don't make vaccines. But as soon as that happens, we need to sequence the virus, and we need to get that sequence to somebody that can make mRNA vaccines, because they're much faster. We already know that. And they're at least as efficacious, if not more, than the other vaccines. Then when they're made, they need to be shipped back to that remote area. Everybody in that area needs to be vaccinated immediately and try to stamp it out before it spreads. I haven't heard anybody talk about that. That is what's next. Let's make sure that happens. And we can start with what we hope doesn't happen, a killer variant, but we need to be aware of that, and then stamp that out wherever it is. Okay, so, the clock's ticking here, and I think we're patting ourselves on the back too soon here, because this is going to happen again. Okay, and I think that's where the consortium really comes in. Okay, that's my view on that.
I'd like to add something just based on Ken, of something I think hasn't worked at all, and particularly in the US, and I think the pharma companies were also particularly bad at this, as was state and city government, was community engagement. And the work that Uche's talking about is amazing. I think it happened too late, and I think it happened on the initiative of citizens that wanted to do it. But certainly, I joke around with people that say, how many times during the pandemic did you get an email or text from Governor Cuomo saying, how you doing? Or what do you need in a vaccine site, or where you're going to go? There was no community engagement. And, in what Ken's talking about, and if we look at our experience vaccinating people for Ebola or measles, I've worked on global vaccines for pretty much the last 15 years. You don't just pilot stuff in there. You got to talk to people about what they want, what they need, as you said, about how are they going to get to the site? What are the opportunity costs for them? So I think a big missing part and a big lesson learned is you got to partner with the community from day one. I'd love to hear Uche's perspective on that too.
I agree with that. I just want to say one thing. You have to remember the people that were making these vaccines are literally killing themselves 24/7. They're not, and they're around other people where in the beginning, because we didn't have enough vaccines to get everybody vaccinated that was making the vaccines. This was an incredible achievement. And we were struggling just to get enough vaccines to the United States. Okay, so and this isn't a point of contention potentially, but the decision was made, and I think it's the right one, that the people that were dying, okay, predominantly were in a certain age range, and I do think that was the way the priority rolled out in the United States. I think that was appropriate. With the healthcare professionals being first, which I also think was appropriate. Now, there just was not enough vaccine to do everything what we wanted. Now, that doesn't excuse us, and I mentioned this before, that we did not anticipate, because you know what? We're scientists. We needed more engagement from people like you. I agree with that completely.
Right.
We did not, and so that's on us, but it's also on the United States government. Okay, I mean, they were doing this, and of course there's a different administration, but I just want to say, I don't think it's all just pharma's fault.
And in fact, one of the lessons, I think, is that collaboration needs to become all of our middle names. That has to be a top priority in complex subjects like this. Similarly complex, let's turn our attention for a minute to research. Are we doing the kind of research that we need on both vaccine development and distribution and access regarding hesitancy, access? We've even heard recently about vaccine convenience. What types of research are needed, both from a basic science or biological sense, and also in a public health and social service sense? Do you want to start off with that, Dr. Blackstock?
Oh, yeah, sure. There is like a whole field around health communications and health literacy, and it probably doesn't get enough attention until times like this. But even when you look at, and I hate that term vaccine hesitancy, because I don't think that's the case for everyone who is not vaccinated. I think that there's a lot of nuance. I think that group is incredibly diverse in terms of regions, perspectives, backgrounds, political affiliations. And I think that actually what we've seen over the last few years is that, there's been, a spurt because of social media, but a burst in misinformation out there, increased distrust for the government, especially in this country. But if you actually look at globally, there's also increased mistrust towards vaccines and government as well. So it's not just something that is specific to the United States, but obviously hoping that we use this moment as a learning moment to realize that I think manufacturing the vaccines, while just an amazing feat, it's only one part of getting to vaccinations, right? To getting the vaccines into the arms of people, and really to understanding, what are people's concerns about the vaccine that would prevent them or from getting vaccinated. Obviously, the access is one issue, but we really just have to admit, especially in this country, that there is a segment of the population that does not want to get vaccinated. There are people who are adamantly against vaccines, and really there's no reasoning with them. But when the next pandemic happens, we're going to need to be able to engage with these communities, right? And we need to be thinking about that now as opposed to in the future.
Nina, are people at your institute and at Columbia preparing and doing the kind of research that we need for the next pandemic?
It's a great question. I mean, one thing I think we all need to pay more attention to is something called implementation research, which is, as we're rolling things out, how's it working and how can we improve how we're doing? I think business used to call it operations research, now in healthcare. So that's something I think has been underfunded, and there's a lack of attention to it sort of throughout the pandemic. On the research side, I mean, I work with a group called CEPI, which is part of COVAX, and they're focused really on investing in research. The idea is being able to produce a pan coronavirus vaccine within 100 days. So that's a great group looking at all sorts of capacities. And one thing I just wanted to mention too is this, I think a big part in the field that I work in is also this idea of distributed know-how. So how do we ensure that 10, 20, 15 years from now, ideally sooner, that there is knowledge generation, vaccine manufacturing, new technologies coming out of Africa? So not just what we call in vaccines fill finish, which means we send them the vats. I always talk about a vaccine manufacturing plant looks a lot like a mixture between a beer factory and a neonatal NICU, because everybody's in white suits, so it doesn't get contaminated, but it's like big beer vats. But so fill finish is you can send the stuff and they can fill it and cap it, but that's not really it. So how can we also invest, and I think this is beginning to happen and should be part of the response, to invest in basic research and science capacity so that our major manufacturing is not Europe and the US, and to some extent now India, which is great, but also coming out. And so remembering that value chain is not just the end of it, the vaccines, but it starts with the basic science all the way through to the delivery.
Speaking of basic science, Ken, are companies like Moderna and others doing the right research for the next pandemic?
I don't know about the next pandemic. There's certainly, the next pandemic could actually be a sub-pandemic of the current one if the wrong variant arises, and I think most of the work is being done on that. I think there's another thing that we should be thinking about for the next pandemic and even the variants. As I mentioned previously, there was exclusion of patients that had transplants, that were immunosuppressed, that had cancer, that had other things which we know would blunt their immune response. And it's becoming increasingly clear, as some of those people have now been vaccinated, that they are not getting adequately protected by the current vaccines. They couldn't mount a high enough response. This is a special subgroup, probably accounts for maybe 4 or 5% of the patient population, but it's significant because those people see other people. They could easily catch a variant, and we need testing. And the testing needs to be able to address not just do you have antibodies, but are you actually protected? And to do that, you need to know the quantities of neutralizing antibodies. And there is technology that's being developed that will allow that to happen more cheaply and quickly. The technology exists and it's being developed by a number of different people. And so I think that's something to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Ken. Debbie, do you have another group question? And then we can go to some questions from the audience.
Great. The third discussion topic is how is a lack of vaccine access and vaccine hesitancy manifested in a variety of populations in the US and the world, and your suggestions for uptake? Ken, could you take that one first?
You're asking me to comment on something that I'm not an expert on. So I'll be the first one to agree with Nina Uche that we need to have more forums like this where there are actually action points. That's one of the things I do think that pharma could have done and should do more of, is we need to get people that are on the ground that understand why we're not penetrating with the vaccines as well as we are, and take their points to heart. This really, I think from a science standpoint, that's all I can talk about because I'm not really an expert in anything else. Is we need to see if we can get vaccines which only need a single administration, that don't need refrigeration, and that are scalable massively for the world. We need to have a tiered approach to the development of vaccines for the next pandemic, knowing that mRNA vaccines can be made quicker, and they need to be get out, as I said before, to healthcare professionals highest at risk, particularly in the area where it's starting. Like if, just example, if Wuhan had gotten, blanketed with vaccines very quickly, there would have been a different kind of response, I think. I think also they need to be made cheaper. The issue of should we get other places to make vaccines? As I said, India is actually quite good at making vaccines. Then it's just not, they're just not mRNA vaccines. But I don't know that, as I said before, I don't think the mRNA vaccines are going to save the world anyway. And we need to do everything we can to get more production of these other vaccines out there to as many people as possible.
Thank you. Uche.
I guess there are a few issues I brought up earlier, but thinking about how successful federally qualified health centers have been over the last few months in terms of the rollout and vaccinating, especially people of color. They vaccinated about 60% of the people they vaccinated are people of color. And so that just, shows kind of where the resources should go, one, but two, just how important, access at a local and hyper-local level is. I mean, to me, this is such common sense, but unfortunately I felt, I think we need to get more vaccines to FQHCs. I mean, obviously that is a success because the communities know the staff there, they know the providers there is already a relationship, right? And so I think again, it's common sense, but we're seeing that it's working. So, Kaiser Family Foundation is collecting a lot of really great data around this. I recommend people following them, especially for issues around vaccine equity and just perspectives on the rollout process. I also the CDC just came out with a study that showed that really it's going to be rural communities that are going to be the most under-vaccinated if things stay the way that they are. So we really need to find a way to talk to or engage with trusted messengers in those communities. I mean, I think even the healthcare providers are having challenges reaching and connecting with patients around vaccine uptake. But I think if we don't connect with those communities, we're going to see outbreaks in those communities as we go along.
Thank you. Nina.
Yeah, I think the federally qualified health centers, my partner works in one in New York, which has a focus on LGBTQ+, and they're just a trusted partner. They serve many underserved New Yorkers. It's a great system. They didn't have as much supply as they could have taken in the beginning, and I think that was sort of unfortunate. I just also think in terms of hesitancy and access, I just think it's a tricky issue because I agree that hesitancy is not a great word, and we really also need to look at access. We had the opportunity very early on in District 1 in New York. New York City said, if you can find a site that's 5,000 square feet, get a provider, we'll give you vaccine. And that was great. We have this federally housing, NYCHA housing, it's our public housing. We found the site, we found the provider, we were ready to go, and we just never got the vaccine. And that would have been so easy. So I just think what I'm most sad about is I think, we knew already, at least in September, that vaccines were a serious possibility. We certainly knew by November that it was happening. And there's so much we could have done to hit the ground running, even with limited supply by January. It was sort of a no-brainer. And we have mobile vans, we have mobile libraries. We could come up with 100 ideas, all of which were pretty easily actionable, even with the hyper cold chain vaccines. But there was political will wasn't there to do that.
We'll have one more question that we'll pose to the entire group, and all of you have touched on this at least partially, but perhaps we could even sharpen our focus even more. Going forward, what do we do better next time to improve vaccine development, the basic science, access, availability, acceptance, distribution? What have science, public health, and public policy learned from this pandemic that will help us in the next pandemic, both in the US and globally? Ken, you've touched on that. Would you like to lead off this last call and response?
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but as I said before, for the next pandemic, I think the mRNA vaccines have proven that they may be our best shot at stamping out the vaccine as much as stamping out the pandemic as early as possible. And because all you need is the sequencing of the virus. I do think the manufacturing of it should probably be done by companies that are already doing it. That's my own view. At the same time, I think the cost of that should not be borne by the United States or whatever. We should have an international fund. This is like climate change. This is a global problem. Every country, and particularly those like the United States that have the ability to pay more, should chip into a fund. And who runs it? I guess the WHO. I'm not, I don't do that kind of stuff, so I don't know who would do it. but we need that. That's the consortium. That's the action point. Let's get ourselves ready, because we know what to do. mRNA vaccines out of the gate, but then immediately start making the other vaccines so that we can anticipate that it's going to spread and that we're going to be ready for it. And then already talking to people like Uche and Nina, okay, we know what the problems are going to be. We should have a game plan. Okay, we need a game plan for the next pandemic. We don't have it. Okay, but we have a lot of lessons that we could get to get that game plan. Okay.
Dr. Blackstock, game plan next time?
I was writing my notes down. Actually, I feel like there's so many things that we've learned in this moment that hopefully next time we can do better. I think, we've seen what happens when you have a chronically underfunded public health system. We don't value public health in this country, and it's underfunded. And we've seen that part of the challenge with the rollout is because we're not giving state and especially local departments of public health the resources that they need. I also think that this pandemic illustrates yet again, the need for a single payer universal healthcare system. I mean, I think that in the midst of the pandemic, people should not have to worry about where they are getting care or if they can access healthcare, right? I mean, and I saw that with some of my patients asking whether or not they would have to pay for a hospital bill, right? They shouldn't have to worry about that. And then I also think that there needs to be just an infrastructure in place for vaccine rollout from when the vaccines are manufactured to how do we get them into the arms of Americans, and how do we do this using an equity lens, right? At every step of the way, thinking about, which communities are being advantaged, which ones are being disadvantaged, how are we measuring our outcomes, how are we holding our systems and institutions accountable as well. I mean, I even think about, I don't know if people have heard of the Black COVID-19 Doctors Consortium. It's led by Dr. Alice Sanford. She's a pediatric surgeon in Philadelphia. They have vaccinated tens of thousands of Philadelphians, mostly people of color, and they've done it just on the ground, boots on the ground, and they've been able to get more and more funding. But we really need more organizations like that are out there embedded in the community, sort of to make that connection.
Thank you, Dr. Blackstock. Nina?
There's a discussion of a treaty now happening at WHO. There's a lot of discussion about a global treaty that would be at the level of the UN, about from all the way across preparedness and response. I think I'd like to take a slightly different aspect on your question, which is, why have so many Americans died? Because of, structural inequity, poverty, racism, lack of access to primary healthcare. People who have managed diabetes have better outcomes than people that don't. That is access to primary healthcare. Why have so many Americans died? Death rates are strength of hospital systems. They're not necessarily COVID. We should be looking all the way along. We should have been looked at hospitalization rates, not at outcomes once you get to the hospital. So what's really the answer is really primary health care accessible for all. And I don't mean to sound super Pollyanna, but with countries with strong primary health care systems, people don't have the underlying conditions that we have in places like the United States, which lead to more severe morbidity and certainly mortality. It made me laugh. I remember the last debate before the primary was canceled. Bernie Sanders, my friend Elizabeth is on the call and she hates it when I talk about Bernie. She's a class ahead of me at Harvard. But Bernie said something like, we should spend $2 trillion on, universal access to healthcare. And everybody, all the Democrats were like, nah, Bernie, where are we going to get the money? And literally 5 days later, we allocated $2 trillion to the COVID response. So I think we just need to step back and really think about funding of primary healthcare as part of our pandemic response.
That's a great illustration of political irony in action. Debbie, would you like to lead us off with some questions submitted by our August audience?
I sure will. So I think we had a question about the 4 A's. So this is Dr. Uche. Dr. Blackstock. I think you both you and Nina have talked about the primary care. And could you go over those 4 A's again? And also, I think I saw another question coming through that had to do with, should we be targeting certain types of clinical specialties and physicians in certain areas, maybe OBGYN or endocrinologists or diabetes care areas or kidney dialysis physicians to be more targeted in our approaches to getting vaccines into the arms of people who have chronic diseases or who are seeing physicians for reasons of basic healthcare.
You know, the training that my sister and I developed were for all healthcare providers, even not just physicians, but all different specialties and provider roles, because we think that anyone who interacts with a patient or anyone from the public, they have an opportunity to engage in a conversation about whether or not that person is open to taking the vaccine, and hopefully will engage in some motivational interviewing skills. But I'm also thinking that even now with 12 to 15-year-olds being eligible for the vaccination, that's another opportunity when families go to the pediatrician's office. We should be offering the entire family vaccines or asking, does anyone else here also need to be vaccinated? So we really need to think about creative ways that healthcare providers can really help to engage with physicians to increase vaccine uptake.
Just to talk about the 4As, and I'll post an article in the chat. The way that we think about access just has 4 components: affordability, acceptability, availability, and accessibility. And so when we think about access, those are the 4 components that we think about, all 4 of those in terms of, are they actually going to reach the people who need them?
Johnson, would you like to pose a question?
Yes, here's a question from Dr. Everett Allen, classmate of class of 73, regarding follow-up and management, really, of the carceral population. As you know, and this will be for all 3 panelists, as you know, during the early parts of the pandemic, many prisons and jails were decompressed for humanitarian reasons. But of course, those people were released into the general population. They were wildly disproportionately people of color. Has there been any specific follow-up to see what that did, what happened as a result of that? This comes from a physician who himself has worked at and cared for inmates at Pelican Bay here in California. So if anyone has knowledge of how that public health almost catastrophe was handled, documented, and perhaps maybe mitigated next time around. Dr. Allen would pose the impossible question, right? We'll have to research that, Dr. Allen, and get back to you for the next forum. Here's another question that is perhaps best directed to Dr. Ken Chin. How can we best advocate for the acceleration of the sharing of intellectual property to enable vaccine makers around the world in middle income and low income countries? You've spoken quite eloquently so far, Ken, about the importance of distributing vaccine distribution, distributing the cost of vaccine development, and having international consortiums. Would you expand on those recommendations to our policymakers?
Well, first of all, I'm certainly not a policymaker, and but I can say what I think. I think a lot of overemphasis has been put on patents and intellectual property. I don't think that there are any barriers with the intellectual property and the patents. As I already said, Moderna, anyone can go out and make Moderna's vaccine now. And the ingredients are actually known. They've been published on the internet. That scientist actually, I think, I'm trying to remember where he's from, I think it's Stanford, actually, analyzed every single component and published it. And so it's known, the recipe's there. So I don't think that is the issue. The next issue would be, would this affect the current pandemic in time? I think the answer is no. Would it help the next pandemic? And I'm open to discussion there. I don't think, just to be honest with you, I think mRNA technology is going to be like recombinant protein technology. It's not there yet, but it's going to be everywhere. I mean, in China now they're making, antibodies that are actually going to be used in the United States, and they've gotten FDA approval. And so you can see that the technology becomes extant and routine. It's not there yet. That's why I think there's a danger in going too soon and trying to say, okay, we're already there, let's start cranking it out, everybody can do it. I think there's a safety issue there. You may have seen people that have gotten CAR T therapy, which is cell therapy that stimulates your immune system to attack cancer. You can die from that. It can stimulate your immune system so much that you can't shut it down. And it's actually what happens with some of the patients with COVID. They get cytokine storm. Well, guess what? These vaccines, if not given the right way, mRNA is highly immunogenic, okay, even when it's modified. And if it's not done right, gee, I'd hate to see it hurt somebody. So that's why I think we've got to be careful here. But I think preparing for the next pandemic and strategically thinking, where would we do this outside the United States and Germany for mRNA vaccines, having a site in Asia that could react quickly, okay, and would have the capability. I'm not saying where it would be. It could be China, it could be Singapore, it could be Korea, it could be Japan, because I think it needs to be in Africa, and we need another site it needs to be in Asia, but we also need a site probably in Africa. So we need to think about where that might be. And they might not have the scalability, but if nothing else, they will have the know-how, how to take care of it and how to distribute it, which is tricky, okay?
Okay, I'll ask the next question. This is, do incentives work? So we've heard of a church in the South that offered a Walmart gift certificate and paid a month's utility bill to those who got the vaccine, and 100% of people did. But when does an incentive an incentive? And when is it a bribe? And when does it work and when doesn't it work? So maybe Ms. Schwalbe, would you take that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in global health, we sort of advise against them because it's better to, work with people so that they understand the value of the health intervention. And it's seen as a pretty short-term, it's not even a fix. So, we really think it's kind of a bad idea, and we can give hundreds of examples. I think the most famous example is clearly India and its sterilization and the incentives that were offered in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s around the world on incentivizing women to get sterilization and men by paying them. And it really just backfires at the end of the day. So I am surprised, actually, we've just started a systematic review on that issue because I'm surprised at how quickly that's become a go-to here, and I find it highly worrisome.
Can I just add, I mean, I do think just because of, all the politicization of mask wearing, of the CDC, of this whole pandemic, that, it's really, I think, there are different segments of the population that have a more difficult understanding of how valuable these vaccines are. And I think what we're seeing even in Ohio with the $1 million lottery, that they've actually seen an uptick in vaccinations since they started the lottery. So hard to say if it's causal or association, but that's what they've seen. And I think that, I agree with Nina that, of course, you want the public to have an appreciation for how that intervention is helping not just the individual, but the whole, right? But I just think that the way that this pandemic has gone on, all of the politics involved has unfortunately, I think that for a certain segment of the population, incentives are actually going to be useful. There's a UCLA Harvard study going on right now, and they found that even offering, they asked people about $25, $50, or $100, and about $100, more people were willing to actually to get the vaccines if you were to offer some money to them. Also, if you were able to say to them, okay, if you get the vaccine, you won't have to wear your mask. Apparently that also, again, this is a study that just was sort of asking people, if this happened, would you do this? It's not necessarily observational, but showed that providing some incentives overall had a net positive effect, and that's an ongoing study. So, but I know Nina's absolutely correct that there's definitely conflicting evidence, and it can be very tricky with incentives.
One of my favorite incentives, given that the pandemic is fueled by obesity, is that Krispy Kreme, as you know, offered free donuts to people with vaccines. So yeah, exactly. Go figure there.
And that became on social media a huge some people were very outspoken about how they didn't think that was a great incentive because donuts are not healthy, and we're encouraging people to eat unhealthy snack foods. Where I just said, look, it's one donut. Like one donut is not going to change things, and if one donut is going to somehow incentivize someone to get this vaccine, then the benefit of that outweighs the 300-calorie donut.
Well, as long as we're on a non-controversial topic like incentives, why don't we continue in that vein and talk about vaccine passports and vaccine opportunities? The CDC
passports are controversial.
Right.
Are you sarcastic?
Right. Let's ask. This may be our last question before we go to our call to action. But what are our three panelists' opinions about vaccine passports or some equivalent, vaccine permission? How would you, if you were a public policymaker, and you are, how would you implement those across our society?
I did want to say that one of the best approaches, I think, for this would be to actually take a page out of the sports, sort of industry in the Olympics, where you have drug testing. So let me just make an analogy here. To go in the Olympics, you got to have drug testing. And I think that it's not unreasonable that if you're going to be an athlete, I'm sure they're going to test whether they're vaccinated or not. And they're not going to rely on whether they have a card or not. Okay, what they should do is do a blood draw and see, do they have neutralizing antibodies to COVID? That tells you, right? That's a number, okay? It tells you that they're protected, other people are protected. As I said, the technology for that particular test is very time consuming and costly. It's a cell-based assay, costs thousands of dollars. But the technology is being developed to allow that to happen very quickly and with as little blood as a finger prick, like you would test for glucose in the diabetic. And this is kind of advanced, the next thing that's coming. And I think that could revolutionize the approach to this. So instead of asking somebody or whatever, you check and see what is your level of neutralizing antibody, and you're going to know. And I do think that there will be some venues and some institutions and some organizations and companies that are going to ask every employee for that, just like you get drug testing for joining the NBA. That's where I think it's going to go. And you could say, I don't want to do that. That's okay. But this is what you have to do, and it's for the public good. That's my view.
We've just got a few more seconds. Any opinions on vaccine passport or a digital equivalent, Nina or Uche?
I think we probably may see more of it than we think. New York State has the Excelsior Pass, and people are not, using it to get into to sporting events or concerts. I could see certain establishments maybe using it to incentivize people, saying like we have only vaccine only folks can come here. Obviously my concerns, obviously of an equity issue, wanting to make sure obviously that it doesn't vaccines don't reinforce any inequities. Just something to think about. I think obviously thinking about it globally is even more concerning, because we don't want a situation where people in high income countries like the US have these vaccine passports, and people in low and middle income countries don't have them and are not able to travel freely and are stigmatized. So I think that the vaccine passport, depending on how it's used, can potentially be problematic.
I guess I think if we're going to do it, we should start with measles, because the United States is one of the greatest exporters of measles globally. Measles is a killer, massive killer of children, of infants. And again, most of the global measles outbreaks in the past 5 years, 7 years have been generated by Americans traveling who haven't been vaccinated. So let's start with measles.
Did the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, a global vaccine partnership launched in 2017, fulfill its promise to stop future epidemics? If not, is the CEPI mechanisms being updated?
I can't say enough about CEPI. I work a conflict of interest. They buy out about 25% of my time. And, for me, I used to explain to people that I work for a group that is working on vaccines for things that are going to kill you that you have never heard of. And one of them in their portfolio, Lassa, MERS, Nipah, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya fever, all these things. And they also had disease X. And a lot of their investments, and maybe Ken can speak to this, they were an early investor there. A lot of their investments in disease X platforms, regulatory harmonization, faster emergency authorization use, a lot of that contributed immensely to the ability to what we call pre-qualify. So that's a sort of a regulatory approval for the world that is required for UN agencies to buy vaccines. So a lot of their legwork around what we call the enabling science, the platform technologies, really accelerated our ability to deliver those vaccines. And while Pfizer may have done it, on its own, or Moderna, for all the other vaccines in the pipeline, and the investment in scale up of manufacturing, they invested in at-risk manufacturing. I'll just end in a sec, but that's a really important part for manufacturing. When you're doing a phase 1 or 2 trial, you need a little bit of vaccine. And usually when that vaccine is found effective, then you scale up manufacturing. Here we needed to do that simultaneously. So CEPI invested in at-risk manufacturing so that even if those trials weren't successful, there would be product ready at the end of the day. So they will continue to contribute. I advise you to look at their website and really watch the space as they continue to fight and grow.
Ken, do you want to give a brief little bit about that? And then Uche, and then I think we'll be ready to move on to the next part of the program.
I just think CEPI played an incredibly important role. One of the things to understand, and I just can again speak from a Moderna standpoint, Moderna had already built a $200 million plant to make something that wasn't even an approved product, which is very unusual. So they were used to taking high risk, and COVID came along, and it just happened that factory could then be redeployed to make the vaccine, and that helped enormously. And then, of course, none of this could have happened without the support of CEPI. That was absolutely critical, I would say, for us. And obviously for BioNTech, they had Pfizer, but CEPI was our, without them, we wouldn't have had the gasoline to get where we did.
I think at this point we will turn the podium over to Marion.
Indeed, thank you all, our panelists, and back to our host.
And thank you all. Class Act is an activist organization, and we encourage everybody who listens and our classmates to work together to create positive change. And if there is any better reason than Ken's young attendee sitting in his window, she represents our future and all that we must be doing not only for ourselves, but for the world coming to the future. So thank you all for helping us think about this. But Class Act is an activist organization. We want you to help us, if you could, each of you, tell us things that we as individuals can do to try to encourage things to go in positive ways, or that our Class Act, HR 73, maybe combined with other class acts, could do something that would move things in the positive direction. So Nina, I'd like to start with you.
I just love vaccines, the power of vaccines. And I think we just have to really be strong in delivering those messages. Vaccines are safe, vaccines are effective, vaccines save lives, and it's pretty much the greatest innovation in public health. So I just hope everybody will encourage their friends and neighbors to continue to be vaccinated, and help those that don't have the access to vaccination to get it.
Ken.
And I echo that. I really have nothing else to say. The vaccines work, and they're available now in the United States. We should get them out to everybody.
Uche.
I mean, obviously, I concur with both Ken and Nina. I guess also just to take home is that, healthcare is not just about health. It's not just about healthcare. What happens within healthcare institutions, as Nina mentioned, we really have to be thinking about the social determinants of health, right? Opportunities for employment, housing, affordable, safe and affordable housing, access to good healthcare, access to healthy food. There are all of these other factors that influence the health of communities that we should also be concerned about, especially when a pandemic happens, and just sort of making sure that we're all aware of that.
Thank you. Johnson.
I'd encourage us all as policymakers to really follow the pathway that Ken has outlined, and that we need to advocate for temporary, partial, emergency, occasional suspension and waiver of intellectual property and patent protections. During extreme global catastrophes like this present pandemic and please Lord, not the next pandemic, we need to suspend those rules temporarily, and we need to be able to share intellectual property and the magic of science that's with our less fortunate middle and lower income countries. The current administration is making moves in that direction. Ken has mentioned several consortia that are already planning to globally fund that, and nationally fund that from using international organizations to defray the cost and offset the cost to the global pharmaceutical manufacturers. And as policymakers and leaders in our own sciences and communities, that's what we can advocate for.
Thank you. And Debbie.
I think I would like to recommend continued research, not only on the vaccines themselves and the development of vaccines and for the next pandemic that occurs, but also more research on how to motivate people to get vaccines to address issues that they have. We realize that there are many communities and cultural differences and other perspectives and communities. And so something that works in one won't work in the other, but there are some things that may work across the board or in specialized communities. We want to make sure that we can find those things that really do work, measure that they can really work using science, using research studies, and then make sure that we can implement those more widely in other communities where they might be efficacious and effective as well, and make sure we can get that information rapidly so that when we do see success, we can replicate it elsewhere.
Thank you all for this entire evening, but particularly for your calls to action at this moment. And I hope we will all take them to heart. And so thank you, Debbie, Johnson, Ken, Nina, and Uche. And our thanks go to the production and program teams for this evening: Andrea Kirsch, Sarah Ulrich, Therese Steiner, Vivian Lewis, Rick Brotman, Katie Marinello, and Diana Levanchu. Thank you to our panelists and to our moderators and to all of you who came and joined us this evening. Good evening.